September 15th, 1945, 13:40 hours. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The autumn sun fell warm across the parade ground, catching the dust motes that hung suspended in the afternoon light. Through the wire fence, beyond the perimeter of wooden barracks painted Regulation Army green, the hills of central Wisconsin rolled away in waves of gold and amber, cornfields awaiting harvest, hardwood forests beginning their slow transformation into the colors of fall. Inside the compound, Japanese prisoners of war stood in formation, 847 men arranged in precise rows, shoulders squared, faces forward, waiting for the announcement they had been told was coming. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor's voice, transmitted by radio across the Pacific, had spoken the unthinkable word, capitulate. For 3 weeks now, since August 15th, the prisoners had existed in a strange, liminal state, no longer enemies, not yet repatriated, suspended between two worlds, two identities, two possible futures. The Americans had raised the volume on the camp loudspeakers, broadcasting the news in Japanese, playing recordings of the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Some prisoners had wept. Others had stood silent, faces blank with incomprehension or shame. A few had attempted suicide, unable to bear the dishonor. But most had simply waited, processing the impossible, trying to understand what came next. Now, standing at attention in the September heat, they waited for Colonel Morrison to speak. The camp commander stepped to the microphone, his interpreter beside him, a Nisei soldier, second-generation Japanese-American, who had served as translator throughout the prisoners' internment. Morrison's voice carried across the formation, calm and measured, and the interpreter rendered his words into Japanese with careful precision. The prisoners would be repatriated. Ships were being prepared. They would return to Japan, to their families, to their homeland. The process would take months. There were over 5,000 Japanese POWs held in camps across the United States, and transportation was limited, but they would go home. Morrison paused, and in that pause, something shifted. He cleared his throat and continued. However, the men had a choice. Any prisoner who wished to remain in the United States could apply for resettlement. They would be given civilian status, work permits, assistance in finding employment. They could stay. The words fell across the formation like stones into still water. Stay, remain in America. The concept was so foreign, so contrary to everything they had been taught about duty, about honor, about the absolute obligation to return to one's homeland, that many prisoners did not immediately comprehend what was being offered. But for others, for men who had spent months or years in American captivity, who had been treated not as animals or objects of contempt, but as human beings, who had eaten 3 meals a day and received medical care and been paid for their labor and been addressed by name rather than number, the offer resonated with a possibility they had not allowed themselves to imagine. Some had known only cruelty in the Imperial Japanese Army. Some had seen the Emperor's portrait for the first time in an American propaganda leaflet and realized they had never known what they were fighting for. Some had worked on American farms, learned English from their guards, eaten Thanksgiving dinner with civilian families who had invited POWs to share their tables. And some, standing now in formation under the Wisconsin sun, had come to understand something that ideology and propaganda had insisted was impossible, that the enemy was not monstrous, that America was not what they had been told, and that returning to a defeated, devastated Japan might mean returning to nothing. In the weeks that followed Morrison's announcement, 87% of the prisoners at Camp McCoy applied to remain in the United States. Across all POW camps holding Japanese prisoners, the figure was similar. Over 90% chose to stay rather than return home. This was unprecedented. German prisoners, held by the tens of thousands in American camps, nearly all requested immediate repatriation. Italian prisoners, treated similarly to the Japanese, overwhelmingly chose to return to Italy. But Japanese prisoners stayed. They stayed in numbers that shocked American authorities. that troubled Japanese government officials, and that challenged every assumption about national loyalty, honor, and the supposed unbridgeable cultural divide between East and West. They stayed because of what they had seen, what they had experienced, and what that experience had taught them about themselves, about America, and about the lies they had been told. And the symbol of that transformation, the recurring image that appeared again and again in their testimonies and letters and post-war interviews, was something as simple and profound as a meal, 3 meals a day, served on metal trays with portions that filled the tray, with variety that changed daily, with the casual abundance that said, "Here, you are not starving, you are not forgotten, you are not worthless." The meal was not kindness. It was something deeper. It was recognition of humanity. And for men who had been taught that surrender meant ceasing to be human, that recognition changed everything. The Japanese prisoners who arrived at American POW camps between 1942 and 1945 came from a military culture that considered surrender the ultimate dishonor. The Imperial Japanese Army's Senjin-kun, instructions for the battlefield, issued in 1941, explicitly stated that soldiers must never surrender. Death in battle was preferable to the shame of captivity. This doctrine was enforced through indoctrination, peer pressure, and the understanding that soldiers who surrendered brought disgrace not only to themselves, but to their families and villages. Japanese soldiers were told that Allied forces routinely tortured and murdered prisoners, that surrender meant suffering worse than death, and that a soldier's duty was to fight until killed or to commit suicide rather than be captured. This ideology was so deeply embedded that early in the war, Japanese forces suffered extremely high casualties rather than surrender. At battles like Saipan and Attu, Japanese garrisons fought to near extinction, with survivors often choosing suicide over capture. The few who were taken prisoner typically fell into Allied hands, while unconscious from wounds or shock, captured before they could kill themselves. These prisoners arrived at American camps expecting torture, execution, or at best, brutal mistreatment. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that Western culture was decadent and cruel, and that prisoners could expect no mercy. Instead, they found something entirely different. The American military, bound by the Geneva Conventions and by a cultural ethos that valued humane treatment even of enemies, had established a network of POW camps across the United States, far from combat zones, where prisoners could be housed securely and inexpensively. The camps were austere but adequate. Wooden barracks, wire fences, guard towers, but also mess halls, medical facilities, recreation areas, and workspaces. Prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers, 2,800 calories per day, with meat, vegetables, bread, and occasional luxuries like coffee and desserts. They were issued uniforms, bedding, and personal hygiene items. They received mail when available and were allowed to send letters home, subject to censorship. They were paid for labor, 80 cents per day for work on farms, in factories, or on infrastructure projects. Wages that seemed impossibly generous to men accustomed to serving without compensation. And they were treated by most guards and camp administrators with basic respect. This treatment was not altruism. It was policy, grounded in pragmatism and law. The United States had signed the Geneva Conventions and chose to adhere to them, partly from genuine humanitarian concern, partly to ensure reciprocal treatment of American POWs held by other nations, and partly because well-treated prisoners were easier to manage and more productive as laborers. But for Japanese prisoners, the motivation mattered less than the experience. They had expected hell and found something incomprehensibly different. The cognitive dissonance was profound and destabilizing. Everything they had been taught about America, about surrender, about their own worthlessness as defeated soldiers, was contradicted by daily reality. This contradiction became the foundation for transformation. The emotional contrast between expectation and experience is documented extensively in prisoner testimonies. Interviews conducted by American intelligence officers, and post-war memoirs written by former POWs. One prisoner, Corporal Hideo Kubota, captured on Okinawa in May 1945 and held at Camp Clarinda in Iowa, described his first days in American captivity in an interview conducted in 1947. When I regained consciousness in the field hospital, I believed I was about to be tortured. I had seen propaganda films showing Americans bayoneting prisoners. When the doctor approached, I tried to move away, but I was too weak. He examined my wounds, spoke to me gently in broken Japanese, and gave me water. I could not understand this. Over the following days, I received medical treatment, food, clean bandages. I waited for the cruelty to begin, for the deception to end, but it did not. When I was transferred to the camp in Iowa and saw the meals, large portions, hot food, meat every few days, I thought perhaps this was a special camp, that I was receiving unusual treatment. Only later did I learn that all prisoners received such meals. This was normal. This was standard. For American soldiers, this abundance was expected. For us, it was incomprehensible. Kubota's experience was representative. Japanese prisoners consistently expressed shock at the quantity and quality of food they received. In the Imperial Japanese Army, rations were meager. Rice, occasional fish or vegetables, rarely meat. Soldiers in forward positions often survived on reduced rations, and those in isolated garrisons sometimes faced starvation. By contrast, American POW camp meals included scrambled eggs for breakfast, sandwiches with multiple fillings for lunch, and dinners featuring beef, pork, or chicken with potatoes and vegetables. Desserts, pies, cakes, cookies appeared regularly. Coffee was unlimited. Prisoners gained weight in captivity, averaging between 10 and 20 pounds in the first months of internment. This physical transformation was accompanied by psychological transformation. Food became a recurring symbol in prisoner accounts, representing not just sustenance, but the broader abundance and organizational capacity of American society. One prisoner wrote in a letter later preserved in the National Archives, "We eat better as prisoners than we ate as soldiers of the Emperor." What does this mean? It means our leaders lied to us about America's weakness. A weak nation cannot feed its enemies so well. A weak nation cannot afford such generosity. We were told America was collapsing, that its people were starving. We were lied to. The camps themselves were sites of complex social dynamics and gradual ideological transformation. Japanese POWs maintained military discipline, electing leaders from among their ranks, organizing barracks life, and attempting to preserve some continuity with their previous military identities. But American camp administrators actively worked to break down the rigid hierarchies and fanatical loyalty that had characterized the Imperial Army. Prisoners were separated by rank to prevent officers from dominating enlisted men. Pro-war hardliners were identified through intelligence screening and segregated into separate compounds where they could not intimidate those willing to cooperate. Educational programs were established, teaching English, American history, and vocational skills. Recreation was encouraged. Baseball became particularly popular, with camp leagues and inter-camp tournaments. Libraries were stocked with books in Japanese, including materials that presented alternative views of the war and Japanese history. And crucially, prisoners were allowed to work outside the camps, on farms and in communities where they interacted with American civilians. These interactions were transformative. Prisoners working on farms in Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, and other Midwestern states encountered rural Americans who treated them as laborers rather than enemies. They were invited into homes for meals, given Christmas gifts, taught English idioms, and shown kindness that contradicted everything they had been told about American racism and brutality. One former prisoner, interviewed for a Japanese television documentary in the 1980s, recalled, "I worked on a farm near a small town in Iowa. The farmer was an old man whose son was serving in the Pacific. He should have hated me. I had fought against Americans, perhaps had killed Americans. But he treated me fairly, paid me my wages, shared his lunch with me. Once his wife invited me into their home for dinner. I sat at their table and ate with them. She served roast chicken and potatoes and pie. While we ate, the farmer asked me about my family, about Japan, about my life before the war. He listened to my broken English with patience. When I left that evening, he shook my hand and said I was welcome to return. I could not reconcile this experience with what I had been taught. If Americans were the devils we were told they were, why would this man, whose son was fighting my countrymen, show me kindness? The transformation of Japanese prisoners' perceptions was not universal or immediate. Many remained loyal to the emperor and to the ideology that had shaped their lives. These men viewed cooperation with Americans as treason, and those who accepted American generosity as weak or corrupted. Within the camps, tensions existed between diehards, those who refused to accept defeat, and those who adapted to their circumstances. Violence occasionally erupted. Prisoners deemed collaborators were beaten or killed by hardliners enforcing conformity. American authorities responded by segregating the most fanatical prisoners into high-security compounds, which reduced but did not eliminate internal conflicts. But as the war's end became undeniable, as news of Japan's devastation spread, and as the reality of the emperor's surrender was confirmed, even many hardliners began to question the certainties they had held. The ideological foundation that sustained their resistance, the belief in inevitable Japanese victory, in the emperor's divine status, in the righteousness of their cause, crumbled when confronted with irrefutable evidence of defeat. For many prisoners, the decisive moment came when they heard the emperor's surrender broadcast. The voice transmitted over the radio was almost incomprehensible. Archaic court Japanese, formal and distant, but the meaning was clear. Japan had lost. The emperor, whom they had been taught was living deity, had ordered them to accept the unacceptable. For soldiers raised to believe that death was preferable to surrender, hearing their supreme commander order the entire nation to surrender created a psychological crisis. Some could not endure it and took their own lives. Others descended into depression or denial. But many experienced a strange liberation. If the emperor himself could accept surrender, then perhaps surrender was not the ultimate dishonor. If the emperor could order his people to lay down arms and submit to occupation, then perhaps their own surrender had not been the betrayal they had believed. The guilt and shame that had tormented them since capture was, if not erased, at least complicated by the emperor's words. They had surrendered because they were wounded, unconscious or overwhelmed, but the emperor himself had surrendered for the sake of the nation. Perhaps they could forgive themselves. Perhaps they could imagine a future. The factual record of Japanese POW treatment in American camps is extensive and overwhelmingly consistent. Approximately 5,500 Japanese military personnel were held as prisoners in the United States during the war, housed in over 50 camps across the country, with major concentrations in Wisconsin, Iowa, Texas, and Montana. The mortality rate among Japanese POWs in American custody was extraordinarily low, less than 1%, and deaths were primarily from wounds sustained before capture or natural causes. This contrasts sharply with the mortality rate of Allied POWs in Japanese custody, which exceeded 27%, with prisoners dying from starvation, disease, forced labor, and outright execution. The disparity reflects the fundamental difference in how the two nations treated prisoners. The United States adhered to international law and humanitarian principles, while Japan did not. For Japanese prisoners who learned, through Red Cross reports and post-war disclosures, how their own military had treated Allied POWs, the contrast was morally devastating. It undermined the narrative of Japanese moral superiority and forced a reckoning with the brutality their own country had inflicted. The decision by over 90% of Japanese POWs to remain in the United States after the war shocked both American and Japanese authorities. The U.S. government had expected nearly all prisoners to request immediate repatriation, as had been the pattern with German and Italian POWs. Preparations were made to transport thousands of men across the Pacific, but the applications never materialized. Instead, camp after camp reported that prisoners were requesting permission to stay. The reasons varied, but centered on several common themes: fear of returning to a devastated homeland with no prospects, desire to escape the shame of having surrendered, appreciation for the treatment they had received, and in some cases, genuine admiration for American society and values. Many prisoners had no families to return to, their homes destroyed by bombing, their relatives killed or displaced. Others feared persecution as defeated soldiers, knowing that Japanese society viewed them as failures and cowards. And many simply preferred the material security and opportunities they had found in America to the uncertainty awaiting them in Japan. One prisoner's application for resettlement, preserved in the National Archives, provides insight into this reasoning. I was born in a small village in Kyushu. My family were farmers, poor but honorable. I was conscripted in 1942 and sent to the Pacific. I was captured on Okinawa, wounded and unconscious. In America, I have worked on farms, learned some English, and saved my wages. I've written to my village and learned that my family is gone, killed in the firebombing of Nagasaki. My home is destroyed. I have nothing to return to. In America, I have been treated fairly. I have learned skills. I wish to remain, to make a life here, to work honestly. I cannot return to Japan, not because I do not love my country, but because my country no longer exists. The Japan I knew is gone. Perhaps it never existed. Perhaps it was always a lie, and I was a fool to believe. I wish to stop being a fool. I wish to live. The American public's reaction to the presence of Japanese POWs on American soil was complex and evolved over time. Initially, there was significant hostility. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, and reports of Japanese atrocities had created intense anti-Japanese sentiment. Communities near POW camps sometimes protested the prisoners' presence, fearing sabotage or objecting to coddling the enemy. But as the war progressed and prisoners began working in agriculture and industry, filling labor shortages caused by the draft, attitudes softened. Farmers who employed POW labor often praised their work ethic, reliability, and willingness to learn. Civilians who interacted with prisoners through church groups, educational programs, or community events frequently reported being surprised by the prisoners' humanity, their courtesy, and their eagerness to cooperate. The prisoners defied stereotypes, and personal contact eroded prejudice. By war's end, many communities that had initially opposed POW camps had become accustomed to the prisoners' presence and even supportive of their remaining after the war. This shift in American attitudes paralleled the shift in prisoners' perceptions of Americans. Just as Americans learned that Japanese prisoners were not the fanatical, subhuman monsters portrayed by wartime propaganda, prisoners learned that Americans were not the cruel, decadent barbarians described by imperial propaganda. Both sides confronted the reality that the enemy was human, capable of cruelty but also of kindness, driven by propaganda but also by genuine beliefs, and ultimately more similar than different in their basic desires for survival, dignity, and a meaningful life. This mutual recognition did not erase the war's brutality or absolve either side of atrocities committed, but it created space for reconciliation and for the possibility that former enemies could become neighbors, co-workers, even friends. The symbolic power of the meal, the recurring image of abundance, variety, and regularity in American POW camp food cannot be overstated in understanding the prisoners' transformation. Food appears again and again in their accounts, not merely as sustenance, but as evidence of a broader truth, that America possessed resources, organizational capacity, and a commitment to humane treatment that exceeded anything they had experienced or imagined. One former prisoner, speaking at a reunion of Japanese-American veterans and former POWs in 1995, reflected, Every day we received 3 meals. Every day the same time, the same abundance. This consistency was for us miraculous. In the Japanese army, we ate when food was available. Often it was not available. We went days with half rations, sometimes no rations. Officers ate first, and if there was not enough, enlisted men went hungry. But in the American camp, everyone ate the same meals, the same portions. The guards ate the same food. Even the camp commander ate from the same kitchens. This equality was strange to us. We had been taught that hierarchy was natural, that suffering was noble. But here we saw a different philosophy, that all men deserve adequate food, that ensuring even your enemies are fed is not weakness, but strength. This lesson stayed with me. When I chose to remain in America, it was not because I hated Japan, but because I wanted to live in a society that operated on these principles. The meal as symbol represented more than food. It represented the ideological foundation of American democracy, the belief that all individuals possess inherent dignity, that government exists to serve the people rather than the people existing to serve the state, and that abundance should be distributed broadly rather than hoarded by elites. These principles were not taught to prisoners through lectures or propaganda, but demonstrated through daily practice. The meal was consistent, adequate, and provided without discrimination. It was not a privilege to be earned or a reward for compliance. It was a baseline expectation. And that expectation, so foreign to prisoners raised in a militaristic society that glorified sacrifice and deprivation, revealed the possibility of a different kind of social order. The logistics of resettling over 4,000 Japanese POWs who chose to remain in the United States posed significant challenges. American immigration laws at the time severely restricted Asian immigration through quotas and exclusion acts. And technically, allowing enemy nationals to remain after the war required legal exceptions and special provisions. The War Department, in consultation with Congress and immigration authorities, developed a process whereby former POWs could apply for residency permits, undergo background checks to ensure they posed no security threat, and receive assistance in finding employment and housing. Many former prisoners settled in the Midwest, where they had worked during their internment and had established connections with farming communities. Others moved to cities, seeking work in manufacturing or service industries. Some attended universities on the GI Bill, a provision that, remarkably, extended to former enemy POWs who had worked for the U.S. military during captivity. They learned trades, started businesses, married, raised families, and became American citizens. The transformation from enemy soldier to American citizen was not seamless or without difficulty. Former prisoners faced discrimination, suspicion, and the burden of their past. They carried psychological scars from combat, from the trauma of surrender, and from the years of ideological confusion and identity reconstruction. Some struggled with guilt, survivor's guilt for having lived when so many comrades died, and moral guilt for having fought for a cause they now recognized as unjust. But many found in America a place where they could reinvent themselves, where their past did not entirely define their future, and where the work of building a life could proceed without the crushing weight of collective shame that awaited them in Japan. They sent money to relatives in Japan, sponsored family members to emigrate, and maintained connections to their homeland. But they remained in America, and their children were born American, grew up American, and understood Japan only through their parents' stories. Stories that often emphasized not pride in the old country, but relief at having escaped it. The Japanese government's reaction to the mass refusal of POWs to repatriate was complicated. Publicly, officials expressed concern for the prisoners' welfare and hoped they would return home to assist in rebuilding the nation. Privately, there was embarrassment and anger. The refusal to return was seen as a repudiation of Japan, a validation of enemy propaganda, and evidence that the prisoners had been successfully indoctrinated by Americans. Some Japanese officials suggested that prisoners who chose to stay were weak-willed, brainwashed, or had always been inferior specimens unworthy of the emperor's service. This rhetoric echoed the wartime contempt for prisoners, and it reinforced many former POWs' decision to stay. If returning meant being stigmatized as traitors or cowards, why return? Better to remain in a country that had treated them with basic decency than return to one that viewed them with contempt. Over time, Japanese society's attitude toward the war, toward surrender, and toward those who survived changed. The post-war period brought economic devastation, occupation, and the dismantling of the militaristic ideology that had driven Japan to war. The emperor remained, but was reduced to symbolic status. Democracy was imposed by the occupying Americans, and gradually embraced by a population exhausted by war and its consequences. The shame associated with surrender diminished, as the entire nation had, in a sense, surrendered. But for those who had surrendered individually during the war and who had chosen not to return, reconciliation with Japanese society remained complex. Some eventually returned to Japan for visits, reconnected with surviving relatives, and made peace with their pasts. Others never returned, preferring to remember Japan as it had been before the war, rather than confront the reality of what it had become. The epilogue of this story extends beyond the individual lives of former prisoners into the broader narrative of Japanese-American relations and the meaning of reconciliation after total war. The Japanese POWs who remained in America became part of the tapestry of immigrant experience, adding their voices to the millions who chose America as their home. Their decision to stay was a vote of confidence in American values, a testament to the power of humane treatment to transform enemies into friends, and a demonstration that ideology, however deeply ingrained, can be changed through experience. They had been taught that Americans were devils, that surrender was unthinkable, that death was preferable to dishonor. They had experienced the opposite, that Americans were human, that surrender was survivable, and that honor could be reconstructed on different foundations. This experience did not erase the horrors of the war, the suffering inflicted by both sides, or the moral complexities of the conflict. But it proved that reconciliation was possible, that former enemies could live together, and that the choice to treat prisoners humanely was not weakness, but strategic and moral wisdom. The broader truth, embedded in the prisoner's choice, is about the nature of freedom and abundance in democratic societies. The meal served on a metal tray, the 3 meals per day that so astonished Japanese prisoners, represented a social contract fundamentally different from the one they had known. In Imperial Japan, the individual existed to serve the state. Sacrifice was valorized. Suffering was expected. Resources were extracted from the population to serve military objectives, and the people were told that hardship was noble, that enduring deprivation was patriotic. In America, despite its flaws and contradictions, the social contract operated on a different principle, that government existed to secure the welfare of the people, that prosperity was a goal to be pursued, and that abundance, when achieved, should be broadly distributed. This principle was never perfectly realized. America had and has deep inequalities, injustices, and failures to live up to its ideals, but the principle existed, and it manifested in policies like feeding POWs adequately, treating them according to international law, and allowing them the choice to remain after the war. For Japanese prisoners standing in formation at Camp McCoy in September 1945, the choice to stay or return was not merely logistical. It was existential. It was a choice between 2 identities, 2 futures, 2 understandings of what their lives could mean. Those who chose to stay were making a bet that America, despite being the enemy that had defeated them, offered a better future than Japan, the homeland they had fought for. They were choosing the abundance they had experienced over the deprivation they had known. They were choosing the treatment they had received over the treatment they would likely receive. And they were choosing, perhaps most fundamentally, to believe that the values America claimed to represent, equality, opportunity, individual dignity, were not merely propaganda, but principles that, however imperfectly practiced, offered a foundation for a meaningful life. The decision haunted some of them for the rest of their lives. They wondered if they had betrayed their families, their comrades, their nation. They carried the complicated grief of having survived when so many did not, of having found comfort in the enemy's hands while their countrymen suffered. But they also built lives, raised children, contributed to their communities, and in their own quiet ways became testimonies to the possibility of transformation, of redemption, and of the idea that individuals are not bound forever by the ideologies into which they were born. Their choice was not a rejection of Japanese culture or identity, but a rejection of the militaristic, oppressive system that had claimed to represent that culture. They chose to define themselves not by the propaganda they had been fed, but by the experiences they had lived and the future they could imagine. To walk today through the sites of former POW camps, now farms, parks, or empty fields, is to walk through landscapes where transformation occurred, where ideologies collided with reality, and where individual human beings made choices that defied expectations. The barracks are gone. The fences have been removed. The guard towers have been dismantled, but the memory remains, preserved in archives, in oral histories, in the descendants of prisoners who stayed, and in the communities that accepted them. The story of Japanese prisoners who refused repatriation is not widely known, overshadowed by larger narratives of the Pacific War, the battles, the atomic bombs, the occupation. But it is a story that illuminates something essential about the war's meaning and its aftermath, that the victory of democratic values was not achieved solely through military force, but through the demonstration that those values, when practiced, could win hearts and minds that ideology had claimed were unreachable. The meal on the metal tray, served daily in POW camps across America, was never intended as a tool of ideological conversion. It was simply the implementation of policy, the adherence to legal obligations, and the expression of a cultural belief that even enemies deserve basic, humane treatment. But in its regularity, its adequacy, and its equality, it became something more, a symbol of the difference between a society organized around the welfare of its people and one organized around the power of its state. For prisoners who had known, only the latter, experiencing the former, was revelatory. They learned that abundance need not be hoarded, that strength could include generosity, and that victory could be achieved without cruelty. These lessons could not be taught through propaganda or lectures. They could only be learned through experience, through the daily accumulation of evidence that contradicted everything they had been told, until the weight of that evidence became undeniable, and the choice to stay became for many the only rational choice. In the end, the prisoners who stayed did not stay because they loved America. Most barely knew it. They stayed because they had seen enough of what America represented to believe it offered something better than what awaited them in Japan. They stayed because 3 meals a day had taught them that abundance was possible, that fairness was possible, and that a society could be organized around principles other than sacrifice and suffering. They stayed because the enemy had treated them better than their own military had, and that fact, however uncomfortable, was undeniable. And they stayed because, in the ruins of their old identities and the uncertainty of their futures, America offered not certainty or comfort, but possibility. The possibility of building a life defined not by the past, but by the choices made in the present. The sound that echoes through this story is not the sound of battle or bombs, but the sound of metal trays being set on tables 3 times a day, in camps across America, carrying meals that were adequate, regular, and given freely. That sound, so mundane, so unremarkable, was the sound of a promise being kept, a social contract being honored, and a demonstration repeated daily for years that even in war, humanity could be preserved. For the prisoners who heard that sound, who ate those meals, and who eventually chose to stay, it became the sound of transformation, the quiet, persistent evidence that change was possible, that enemies could become neighbors, and that the future, though uncertain, was not predetermined by the hatreds of the past. It was the sound of freedom, not as a slogan or abstraction, but as a lived reality, the freedom to eat, to choose, to imagine, and ultimately to stay.